That afternoon was one of the most unexpected, but yet intimate moments I had ever experienced. The afternoon sun streamed through the large windows of our living room, casting a warm golden light over the hardwood floors. It was a quiet day, the kind I usually enjoyed, but today the silence felt different, unsettling almost. My stepson, Alex, had been distant lately, ever since his father, Greg, had left on a business trip last week. There had been a tension in the air between us that I couldn't quite place. I leaned against the kitchen counter, absent-mindedly sipping a glass of water, as I stared out into the backyard. Alex had always been polite, respectful, but distant. I knew it wasn't easy for him. His mother had passed away a few years ago, and even though I had done my best to step into a supportive role, it was clear he still missed her deeply. That's what made our relationship so difficult. No matter how hard I tried, there was always that wall between us. But recently, something had shifted. The way Alex looked at me was different now. His eyes lingered a little too long during our conversations, and I found myself doing the same, though I couldn't quite explain why. I had known him since he was a teenager, but now, at 20, Alex had grown into a man, taller and more confident than the boy I had first met. I was lost in my thoughts when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see Alex, standing in the doorway, his face partially hidden by the shadow of the hallway. "Hey," he said, his voice low. "Can we talk?" I nodded, setting my glass down on the counter. "Sure. What's on your mind?" Alex hesitated for a moment before stepping fully into the kitchen. He leaned against the opposite counter, his arms crossed over his chest. His face was serious, more so than I was used to seeing. The tension in the room grew palpable, and my heart started to race for reasons I couldn't quite understand. "It's about us," he said finally, his voice soft but steady. I blinked, caught off guard. "Us?" "Yeah," he continued, his gaze dropping to the floor for a moment before meeting mine again. "I've been feeling something lately, something I don't know how to deal with." My pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" He took a deep breath, as if preparing himself for what he was about to say. "Ever since Dad left, things have felt different between us. I don't know if you've noticed, but I can't stop thinking about you." His words hung in the air between us, heavy and filled with a meaning that made my chest tighten. I stared at him, my mind racing. Was this really happening? Had I misread things all along? I tried to gather my thoughts, but they were scattered, confused. "Alex, I began, but he cut me off." "Just hear me out," he said, his voice more urgent now. "I know it's wrong. I know it doesn't make sense. But I can't help how I feel. I think about you all the time, and it's driving me crazy." I felt the weight of his confession pressing down on me, and I didn't know how to respond. This was my stepson. I had married his father, built a life with him, and here we were, standing on the edge of something dangerous, something I hadn't seen coming. "Alex, we can't." I struggled to find the right words. "This is complicated." "I know," he said, his voice filled with frustration. "But I can't just pretend I don't feel this way." I stood there, frozen, my mind screaming at me to end the conversation, to shut this down before it went any further. But there was a part of me, a part one didn't want to acknowledge, that understood what he was saying. The looks we had exchanged over the past few days, the lingering touches, the unspoken tension. It had been there, simmering just beneath the surface. And now, it was all coming to a head. "We need to stop this," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "You're confused. This isn't normal." Alex shook his head, stepping closer to me. "I'm not confused. I know exactly what I'm feeling." He was standing right in front of me now, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind racing as I tried to figure out what to do. Every instinct told me to push him away, to end this before it got out of hand. But I couldn't move. I was trapped in the moment, caught between what I knew was right and the undeniable pull between us. "Alex, we can't do this," I said again, my voice trembling. "This is wrong." He looked at me, his expression softening. "I don't care," he whispered. "I just need to know if you feel it too." The question hung in the air, and I felt a rush of guilt wash over me. I should have said no. I should have told him that it was all in his head, that I didn't feel anything for him beyond the love of a parent. But the truth was, I couldn't say that. I had felt it too, the shift, the connection that had grown between us over the past week. I had tried to ignore it, to brush it off as nothing more than passing thought, but now, standing here with Alex so close, I couldn't lie to myself anymore. "I don't know what I feel," I admitted, my voice barely audible. Alex's hand reached out, brushing against mine, and I felt a shiver run through me. His touch was light, almost hesitant, but it was enough to send my heart racing. "We can figure this out," he said softly, his eyes searching mine. Together, I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that we could somehow navigate this without hurting anyone, without destroying the life we had built with Greg. But I knew better. This wasn't just a fleeting moment of confusion. It was something much deeper, much more dangerous. "I need time," I said finally, pulling my hand away. "We need to think about this before we do something we can't take back." Alex nodded, though I could see the disappointment in his eyes. "Okay, I understand." He turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me standing there, my mind spinning with everything that had just happened. I wanted to scream, to cry, to run after him and tell him that everything would be okay. But I couldn't. I didn't know how to fix this. As I stood there in the silence, I realized that nothing would ever be the same again. We had crossed a line and there was no going back. But the story didn't end there. This is where it only had started. The next few days were a blur of awkward silences and stolen glances. Every time Alex and I were in the same room, the tension between us grew thicker, more suffocating. I could feel his eyes on me when we were at the dinner table or when we passed each other in the hallway, but neither of us dared to speak about what had happened in the kitchen. The unspoken words hung between us, like a shadow we couldn't escape. Greg had called that morning to check in, his voice cheerful as he talked about his trip. I forced myself to act normal, to respond with casual interest, but the guilt weighed heavily on my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had already betrayed him, even though nothing had physically happened between Alex and me. The thought of it made me feel sick, but it didn't stop the confusing emotions that swirled inside me every time I looked at Alex. That afternoon, I was sitting on the couch in the living room pretending to read a book, but my mind was elsewhere. The house was quiet, too quiet. Alex had been in his room all day and I hadn't seen him since breakfast. A part of me was relieved we needed space to clear our heads, but another part of me couldn't stop thinking about him. The sound of footsteps on the stairs made my heart skip a beat. I glanced up to see Alex walking into the room, his expression unreadable. He hesitated for a moment, then sat down on the other end of the couch, leaving a careful distance between us. "Hey," he said quietly, his eyes flicking up to meet mine. "Hey," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. We sat there in silence for a few minutes, the air between us thick with unspoken tension. I could feel the weight of his presence, the pull that I had been trying so hard to ignore, but it was impossible to escape. Finally, Alex broke the silence. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and serious. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. I had been dreading this conversation, but I knew it was inevitable. "Yeah," I agreed. "We do." He shifted slightly on the couch, turning to face me. His expression was conflicted, torn between the emotions that I knew were eating him up inside. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened the other day," he began, his voice shaky, and I know it was intense, but I don't regret it. I felt my heart drop at his words. "Alex, I know it's wrong," he interrupted, his voice more urgent now, "but I can't help how I feel. I don't want to pretend like this isn't real." I stared at him, my mind racing. This wasn't just a crush. This was something deeper, something I hadn't prepared for. I wanted to tell him to stop, to remind him of the consequences, but I knew he was right. There was no denying that what we had felt in that moment was real, but that didn't make it right. "We can't do this," I said softly, though my voice trembled. "You know we can't." Alex's eyes searched mine, and I could see the pain there, the confusion. "I know it's not easy," he whispered, his voice full of emotion, "but I don't want to lose this connection between us. I don't want to lose you." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to tell him that he wasn't going to lose me, that we could go back to the way things were before, but I knew that wasn't true. Things had already changed, and there was no undoing that. "Alex, you're my stepson," I said quietly, my heart heavy. "We can't ignore that." He looked down at his hands, his expression pained. "I know," he muttered, "but that doesn't change how I feel." The room felt too small, too suffocating, and I could feel the walls closing in around us. I needed to get out, to clear my head before I said something I couldn't take back. "I need some air," I said, standing up abruptly. I just need to think." Without waiting for a response, I walked out the back door, stepping into the warm afternoon air. I leaned against the railing of the porch, taking deep breaths to calm my racing heart. The guilt was overwhelming, but so was the confusion. How had things spiraled so far out of control? I heard the door open behind me, and I turned to see Alex stepping outside. He looked just as conflicted as I felt, and I could see the pain in his eyes. He walked over to me slowly, stopping a few feet away, as if he wasn't sure how close he was allowed to get. "I'm sorry," he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I didn't mean to make things harder for you." I shook my head, trying to push down the emotions that were threatening to spill over. "It's not your fault," I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. "This whole situation is just complicated." He took a step closer, his eyes full of vulnerability. "We can figure it out," he said quietly. "Together." I looked at him, my heart aching with the weight of everything unsaid. There was a part of me that wanted to believe him, that wanted to give in to whatever this was between us. But I couldn't. I couldn't let things go any further. "We need to be careful," I said, my voice trembling. "We can't hurt Greg. He's your father." Alex's face softened and he nodded slowly, though I could see the sadness in his eyes. "I know," he whispered. I don't want to lose you." I felt a lump form in my throat, and I struggled to keep my emotions in check. "You won't," I promised, though the words felt hollow. "We'll figure this out." We stood there in silence for a long moment, the tension between us still thick, but tempered by the understanding that we couldn't let things go any further. It was a fragile truce, but it was all we had. As the sun began to set, casting a warm orange glow over the yard, Alex took a deep breath and stepped back. "I guess I'll go inside," he said softly. "I'll give you some space." I nodded, watching as he turned and walked back into the house. As the door clicked shut behind him, I let out a shaky breath, my heart still pounding in my chest. I knew this wasn't the end of the conversation, but for now, it was enough. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the edge of something dangerous, something that could tear our family apart if we weren't careful. And the story didn't end there. It definitely didn't. The days that followed were painfully slow. Each moment I spent around Alex felt like walking on eggshells, and it was impossible to ignore the growing tension between us. We were both trying to pretend things were normal, but nothing felt the same. The unspoken connection simmered beneath the surface, threatening to boil over with every shared glance or fleeting touch. Greg's absence only made things harder. Without him around, it was just me and Alex navigating this uncharted territory without the buffer of another presence to keep us in check. Every time I heard Greg's voice over the phone, guilt gnawed at my insides. He had no idea what was happening between his son and me, and I hated myself for the secret we were keeping. One evening, after an especially awkward dinner, I found myself sitting on the couch trying to lose myself in a movie. The flickering screen cast a soft glow across the room, but my mind was elsewhere. I could hear Alex moving around in the kitchen, the sound of dishes clinking together as he cleaned up. He had offered to help with the chores more lately, as if trying to bridge the growing distance between us. After a few minutes, he walked into the living room, drying his hands on a towel. He hesitated by the door for a moment, his eyes lingering on me before he spoke. "Can I join you?" he asked quietly. I nodded, though the pit in my stomach tightened. "Sure," I said, forcing a smile. "I'm just watching some old movie. You might not like it." Alex shrugged, sitting down beside me on the couch, though he left a noticeable space between us. "That's okay. I just didn't want to be alone." His words hung in the air, and I felt my heart ache. The loneliness in his voice was palpable, and I couldn't help but feel responsible for some of it. I had always tried to be there for Alex to support him after his mother's passing, but now it seemed like I was the one creating more distance between us. We sat there in silence for a while, the movie playing in the background, but neither of us paying much attention. I could feel Alex's presence beside me, and every subtle movement he made only heightened my awareness of how close he was. The tension between us felt almost unbearable, like we were waiting for something to break. Finally, Alex spoke again, his voice soft but filled with emotion. "I've been thinking about everything, about what you said." I didn't respond right away, my chest tightening at the thought of where this conversation might go. And I asked cautiously, my eyes still focused on the TV. "I get it," he said, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. "I get why you're scared, but I don't know how to stop feeling this way." I turned to look at him, my heart pounding in my chest. His expression was raw, vulnerable, and I could see the weight of everything he was holding inside. It was clear he had been struggling with this just as much as I had, and that only made it harder. "I don't know how to stop either," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Alex's eyes widened slightly, and I could see a flicker of hope in his expression. "Then why are we pretending?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Why are we acting like this isn't real?" "Because it's dangerous," I said, my voice trembling. "Because if we go any further, there's no going back." He looked down at his hands, his jaw clenched tightly. "I know," he whispered, "but I can't stand this, pretending like nothing's happening between us. It's killing me." The raw honesty in his voice shook me to my core, and I felt a rush of conflicting emotions surge through me. I wanted to protect him, to shield him from the confusion and pain that this situation was causing, but I didn't know how. Every time we tried to distance ourselves, the pull between us only grew stronger. "Alex, we can't keep doing this," I said softly, though the words felt hollow. "We need to find a way to move past this before it destroys us." He looked up at me then, his eyes filled with desperation. "And what if I don't want to move past it?" he asked, his voice cracking. "What if I don't want to lose this? To lose you?" His words hit me like a ton of bricks, and I felt my resolve crumbling. I wanted to tell him that he wasn't going to lose me, that we could find a way to navigate this without crossing any more lines. But I knew that was a lie. The truth was, we were already too far gone. The tension, the emotions, the connection, it was all there, undeniable and impossible to ignore. "Alex," I began, my voice shaking, "I don't know how to fix this." He reached out then, his hand brushing against mine, sending a shiver through me. The contact was brief, tentative, but it was enough to send my heart racing. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine, and I could see the question there, the unspoken plea for something more, for permission to cross the line that we had been towing for days. "I don't need you to fix it," he whispered. "I just need you to be honest with me. Do you feel it too?" My breath caught in my throat, and I felt the weight of his words pressing down on me. This was a moment of truth, the moment where everything could change. I wanted to deny it, to tell him that it was all in his head, but I couldn't lie. "Not anymore." "I do," I whispered, the admission slipping out before I could stop it. Alex's eyes softened, and I could see the relief there, the weight lifting from his shoulders. He didn't say anything, but the look on his face said it all. We were standing on the edge of something dangerous, something we couldn't take back, and I didn't know how to stop it. But before either of us could say another word, the sound of the front door opening shattered the moment. Greg was home. I pulled my hand away from Alex's, my heart pounding in my chest, as I heard Greg's voice calling out from the hallway. Panic surged through me, and I stood up abruptly, moving away from the couch just as Greg stepped into the living room. "Hey," Greg said, smiling as he set down his suitcase. "I'm back, miss me?" I forced a smile, trying to calm the racing thoughts in my head. "Of course," I said, though my voice felt shaky. "How was the trip?" Greg launched into a story about his meetings and the people he had seen, completely unaware of the tension that filled the room. Alex sat on the couch, his expression neutral, but I could see the emotion swirling just beneath the surface. As Greg continued to talk, I felt a sense of dread settle in the pit of my stomach. Things were spiraling out of control, and I didn't know how much longer we could keep this secret. The next few days were a blur of forced smiles and strained conversations. Greg was back, oblivious to the growing storm between Alex and me, and it only made things worse. Every time I looked at Alex, I could see the hurt in his eyes, the weight of everything we hadn't said pressing down on both of us. But we couldn't talk about it, not with Greg around. We were trapped in this uncomfortable dance, pretending that everything was fine while the tension between us simmered just beneath the surface. One evening, after Greg had gone to bed, I found myself alone in the kitchen, staring out the window at the darkened backyard. The house was silent, but my mind was racing. I couldn't stop thinking about Alex, about the shared moment before Greg had come home. The confession I had made, admitting that I felt something for him too, hung over me like a heavy cloud. There was no going back from that, and I knew it. I was lost in thought when I heard the soft creak of the floorboards behind me. I turned around to see Alex, standing in the doorway, his expression serious. He hadn't said much since Greg had come home, but I could tell he was struggling just as much as I was. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly, stepping into the kitchen. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "Yeah," I said, though I wasn't sure if I was ready for this conversation. Alex walked over to the kitchen table and sat down, his hands folded in front of him. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with the same mix of emotions I had seen the other night. Confusion, frustration, longing. "I can't keep doing this," he said softly, his voice full of emotion. "I can't keep pretending like everything's fine when it's not." I swallowed hard, moving to sit across from him. "I know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Neither can I." He looked at me, his eyes searching mine. "I meant what I said the other night," he continued, his voice trembling slightly. "I don't know how to stop feeling this way, and I don't think I want to." His words hit me hard, and I felt the weight of them settle over me like a lead blanket. This wasn't just a passing moment of confusion for him. This was something real, something he wasn't willing to let go of. "Alex, I started, but he cut me off." "I know it's complicated," he said quickly, his voice urgent. "I know we can't just be together, but I don't want to lose what we have. I don't want to lose you." The desperation in his voice broke my heart. I could see how much he was struggling, how much this was tearing him apart, and it killed me to know that I was part of the reason for his pain. "You're not going to lose me," I said softly, though the words felt hollow. "But we have to be careful. We can't let this get out of control." He nodded slowly, though I could see the frustration in his eyes. He whispered, "But I don't know how to control it. Every time I'm around you, I can't stop thinking about what it would be like if things were different." His words sent a shiver through me, and I felt my heart race. I knew exactly what he meant because I had been thinking the same thing. What if things were different? What if there were no rules, no boundaries, no complications? But that wasn't our reality. We couldn't ignore the fact that we were bound by those rules, no matter how much we wanted to break them. "We have to be careful," I repeated, more for my own sake than his. This could ruin everything. He looked down at his hands, his jaw clenched tightly. "I know," he muttered, "but it doesn't make it any easier." The room was silent for a long moment, the only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator. I didn't know what to say. Every word felt like a lie, Like I was trying to convince myself that we could just sweep this under the rug and move on. But I knew better. Things had already gone too far, and we were standing on the edge of something dangerous. "What do you want to do?" I asked finally, my voice trembling. "Where do we go from here?" Alex looked up at me, his eyes filled with emotion. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know I don't want to keep pretending. I don't want to lie to myself anymore." His words sent a wave of panic through me. The idea of Alex not pretending, not holding back, terrified me. What would that mean for us? For our family? How could we possibly navigate something so complex without tearing everything apart? "We can't let Greg find out," I said, my voice more urgent now. This would destroy him. Alex's face tightened, and I could see the guilt flash across his features. "I know," he said softly. "I don't want to hurt him. I don't want to hurt anyone. But I also don't want to lose myself in all of this." I felt a lump form in my throat as his words hit me. He was right. We couldn't just pretend this wasn't happening, but we also couldn't let it ruin everything we had built. We were walking a fine line, and one wrong step could send everything crashing down. "I care about you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But we have to be careful. We have to protect this family." Alex nodded, though I could see the sadness in his eyes. "I know," he whispered, "but it still feels like we're losing something." The weight of his words pressed down on me, and I knew he was right. No matter how we handled this, we were going to lose something, whether it was the connection we had or the stability of our family. Something was going to break, and that terrified me. "We'll figure it out," I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. "We just need time." Alex looked at me, his eyes filled with a quiet desperation. "How much time?" he asked softly, "because it feels like the longer we wait, the harder this gets." I didn't have an answer for him. I didn't know how much time we needed or if time would even help. All I knew was that we couldn't keep going the way we were. Something had to give. "We'll figure it out," I repeated, though the uncertainty in my voice betrayed me. For the next few days, things were tense between us. Alex and I barely spoke, both of us trying to process what had happened and what it meant for our future. Greg remained oblivious, continuing with his normal routine, while Alex and I danced around each other, careful not to let the tension spill over. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, I found myself sitting on the porch staring out at the dark yard. The weight of everything that had happened was pressing down on me, and I felt like I was drowning in it. I didn't know how to move forward. I didn't know how to fix this. The sound of the porch door creaking open startled me, and I turned to see Alex standing in the doorway. He hesitated for a moment before stepping outside, his expression unreadable. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked softly, though I already knew the answer. He shook his head, walking over to sit beside me. "I've been thinking," he said quietly, his voice low, "about everything." I nodded, waiting for him to continue. "I think," he began, his voice shaky, "I think I need to leave, to get some space." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt my chest tighten. "Leave," I repeated, my voice trembling. "What do you mean?" "I think it's the only way," he said, his eyes filled with emotion. "I can't stay here, pretending like everything's fine when it's not. I need to figure out what I want, and I can't do that here." The thought of him leaving sent a wave of panic through me. But I knew he was right. Things had gotten too complicated, too messy, and maybe space was the only way we could figure out how to move forward. "Okay," I said softly, though the word felt like it was ripping me apart. "If that's what you need." Alex looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and relief. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't want it to come to this." I shook my head, forcing a smile. "It's not your fault," I said, though my heart ached. "We'll figure it out. Just take the time you need." He nodded, and we sat there in silence, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on both of us. I didn't know what the future held for us, but I knew that nothing would ever be the same.